The Long and Painful Death by Claire Keegan. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when she finally crossed the bridge to Atchil. There at last stood the village, the fisherman's co-op, the hardware and grocery, the chapel of reddish stone, every building locked and silent under the dimly burning streetlights. On she drove along the dark strip of road where, on either side, tall rhododendron hedges had gone wild and out of bloom. Not one person did she see, not one lighted window, just a few sleeping, black-legged sheep, and later a fox standing fearsome and still in the headlights. The way grew steep, then rounded into a wide, empty road. She could feel the ocean, the bogs, immense open space. The turn for Dugort wasn't clearly marked, but she felt confident in turning north along the uninhabited road that took her to the Bowl House. Twice on the journey she had pulled onto the hard shoulder and shut her eyes and briefly slept, but now, on the island, she felt wide awake and completely alive. Even the pitch-black length of road, which steeply fell to the beach, seemed full of life. She sensed the high, sheltering presence of the mountain, the bare hills, and, far below, where the road ended, the clear, pleasant thumps of the Atlantic on the shore. The caretaker had told her where to find the key, and eagerly her hands searched around the gas cylinder. There were several keys on the ring, but the first she chose turned the lock. Inside, the house was renovated, the kitchen and the sitting room now combined into one long open room. Same whitewashed fireplace was set at one end, but a new sink and cabinet were fitted at the other. In between stood a couch, a pine table, and hard matching chairs. She let the tap run and boiled the kettle for tea, lit a small fire with turf from the basket, and made up a temporary bed on the couch. Just outside the panes, a hedge of fuchsia was trembling brilliantly in the very early morning. She undressed, lay down, and reached for her book, and read the opening paragraph of a Chekhov story. It was a fine paragraph, but when she had reached its end, she felt her eyes closing, and happily she turned out the light, knowing that tomorrow would be hers, to work and read and walk along the roads and to the shore. When she woke, she felt the tail end of a dream, a feeling like silk disappearing. Her sleep had been long and deeply satisfying. She boiled the kettle and took her belongings from the car. She had bought little, some books and clothes, a small box of groceries. There were notebooks and several scraps of paper on which half-legible notes were written. The sky was cloudy but promising, streaked with patches of blue. Down at the ocean, a ribbon of water rose into a glassy wave and fell to pieces on the strand. She felt hungry to read and to work. She felt she could sit for days reading and working, seeing no one. She was thinking of her work and exactly how she would start when the house phone rang. Several times it rang before it went silent, and then it started again. She reached out, not so much to answer it as to make it stop. "Hello?" said a man with an accent. "This is..." and a foreign name. "Yes?" "The director said that you are a resident. I'm a professor of German literature." "Oh," she said. "Might I see the house? He said you might let me see." "Well," she said, "I wasn't..." "Oh, you're working?" "Working?" she said. "I am working, yes." "Yes?" he said. "I have just arrived," she said. "I have spoken to the director and he said you will let me see. I am standing outside the Bowl House now." She turned towards the window and picked a green apple from the cardboard box. "I am not dressed," she said. "I'm working." "It's an intrusion," he said. She looked into the sink. Daylight was reflecting off the steel. "Could you come another day?" she said. "How about Saturday?" "Saturday," he said. "I will be gone. I have to go away, but I'm standing outside the Bowl House now." She stood there in her nightdress with the apple in her hand and thought about this man standing outside. "Are you about this evening?" "Yes," he said. "This evening might suit you?" "If you come at 8, she said, I will be here." "I must come back then?" "Yes," she said, "you must come back." When she put the phone down, she looked at it and wondered why she had picked it up and why they had given out the number. She resented, for a moment, the fact that there was a number. What had begun as a fine day was still a fine day, but had changed. Now that she had fixed a time, the day in some way was obliged to proceed in the direction of the German's visit. She went to the bathroom and brushed her teeth and thought of him, standing outside. She could quickly change out of a nightdress, go out and tell him to come in, and the day would, again, be hers. Instead, she sat at the hearth and poked the ashes in the grate and stared at the large glass jug on the mantel. She would walk down to the shore and pick fuchsia off the hedges and fill the jug with the red, dangling blossom before he came. She would take a long bath. She looked for her watch, but it took several minutes to find it, in the pocket of the jeans she'd worn yesterday. She stared for a full minute at the white face. The time now, on this, her 39th birthday, was just past midday. Quickly, she got up and went into Ball's study, a small room with a disused fireplace and a window facing the sea. It was in this room that he had written the now famous journal, but that was 50 years ago. Ball was dead, and his family had left the house as a working residence for writers, and now she was here for 2 weeks working. She wiped off the desk with a damp cloth and placed her notebooks and dictionary, her papers and her fountain pen on the surface. All she needed now was coffee. She went to the kitchen and looked through the box of groceries. She spent more time looking through the cabinets but found no coffee. She did milk also. She would soon run out of milk, but all she wanted to do was work. This is what she was thinking when she took up her keys and drove back along the road to the village. There, without delay, she bought coffee and milk, fire lighters, a cake mix, a pint of cream, and the newspaper. The sun was strong when she was coming back along the road, so instead of going directly home, she took the turn south along the Atlantic Drive, where dwellings were few and hardly a bush was standing. She thought about how it must be to live in this place in winter, the high winds driving sand across the beaches, shearing the hedges, the relentless rain, the gulls, cold screeches, and how dramatically all of that would change once winter finally ended. On the edge of the road, a small, plump hen walked purposely along, her head extended and her feet clambering over the stones. She was such a pretty hen, her plumage edged in white as though she'd powdered herself before she stepped out of the house. She hopped down to the grassy verge and without looking left or right raced across the road, then stopped, readjusted her wings and made a clear line for the cliff. The woman watched how the hen kept her head down, and when she reached the edge and how, without a moment's hesitation, she jumped over it. The woman stopped the car and walked to the spot from which the hen had flung herself. Part of her did not want to look over the cliff, but when she did, she there saw the hen with several others, scratching or lying contentedly in a pit of sand on a grassy ledge not far below. She stood there for a while watching the scene, feeling amused, then looked out over the ocean so wide and blue under the wide blue sky. Further ahead was a small cove where a pool of deep, clear water was edging towards the base of a white cliff. She left the car and followed a sheep track towards the cove, but the path disappeared and the descent became too frightening and steep. From where she stood she could see it all, the perfectly deep pool, the rocks, the dark tangle of seaweed under the water's surface. She clambered up the way she had come, crossed the other side of the cove and found a different track, which led down to a stream of brackish water flowing off the bogs. With care she stepped over the flat brown stones, followed the slippery path and came out into the cove of white sun. Debris had washed up from the high tide, but all around her were deep layers of glistening bleached stones. Never had she seen such beautiful stones, clanging like Delft under her feet every time she moved. She wondered how long they had lain there and what type of stone it was, but what did it matter? They were here now as she was. She looked around and seeing no one, took her clothes off and awkwardly stepped onto the rough, wet stones at the water's edge. The water was much warmer than she had imagined. She'd waded out until it deepened suddenly and she felt the slimy thrill of the seaweed against her thighs. When the water reached her ribs, she took a breath, rolled onto her back and swam far out. This, she told herself, was what she should be doing at this moment with her life. She looked at the horizon and found herself offering up thanks to something she did not truly believe in. She had now reached the point where the pool broadened out to open water. She'd never been in such deep water. The longing to go out further was strong, but she fought against it, floated for a while, then swam back to the shore and lay on the warm stones. Lying there, she felt, high above, a presence on the cliff, but in the sunlight she could not see properly. She lay there until her skin was dry, and then quickly dressed and climbed back along the steep path to the car. Back at the house, she thought of her work while she made a dark chocolate cake. She did not make the cake from scratch, but from the ready-made mix. All she had to do was add eggs, oil and water. While she mixed the batter and poured it into a tin, a part of her mind had again preoccupied with the Germans coming. She wondered for a moment what he would look like, how tall he would be. He might have some interesting things to say about Henrik Boll. She felt at a loss and slightly ashamed, knowing so little about the man in whose house she was staying. At 4 o'clock she walked down the road past the Protestant church towards the sea. There stood a one-room schoolhouse, whose playground was full of dead, shaggy-headed thistles. As she stood there, a sudden breeze came over the place, and some of the thistledown came loose and floated before her eyes. On she walked to the end of the road, where a cluster of unremarkable holiday homes stood empty, their ash buckets emptied by the wind. It was colder down in the ocean, so she turned back up the hill, breaking fuchsia off the hedges as she went along. Some of the slender boughs snapped easily, making a clean break, while others had on stubbornly, so that she had to twist them off with her bare hands. She liked their bright red, drooping flowers, their hardy, toothed leaves. When she came back to the house, she paused to look at the sign. Please respect the privacy of artists in residence. She stood there for a moment, looking at the words, then walked into the yard and shut the gate to keep the sheep out. Instead, she filled the big glass jug with water and arranged the fuchsia in an unruly display on the kitchen table. She made for herself a light supper of sliced tomatoes and cheese and ate at the table with yesterday's bread and a glass of wine. When the dishes were rinsed and put away, she lit the fire and returned to the Chekhov story. It's a story of a woman whose fiancé was not engaged in any type of work, but was known, instead, as someone who played music. She had reached the point of the story where he had taken his betrothed to the house in which they would live, and showed her all the rooms. He had a tank of water fitted in the attic and a sink in the bedroom into which cold water ran. There was a gold-framed picture on the wall depicting a naked woman and a purple jug whose handle was broken. Something about the picture nauseated the bride-to-be. At every minute she was on the point of bursting into sobs, of throwing herself out the window and running away. Something about the story now put the woman in mind of how she had been at another point in her life, when she was falling out of love with a man who she said he wanted her to live with him. A man who often said the opposite of what he felt, as though the saying of it would make it true or hide the fact that it was not. I love you, he often said. There is nothing I would not do for you, he often said also. Once they were getting ready to go out, she had put her hair up, pinned it loosely, and had chosen a long velvet dress. She was thinner then and in her 20s. I like you like this, the separated man had said that night, but she'd known it wasn't true. He preferred her in a short skirt with high heels, with her hair loose and her lips painted red. She thought of him now as she ran her bath with clouds of steam blowing out through the open window. Is there anything you would not give me? She asked. What? Nothing, he said instantly. There is nothing. For some reason she kept looking at him and had waited. Well, he said, clearing his throat, maybe the land. I wouldn't like to give you the land. And land, she had always known, was all he cared about. So now she poured some rose oil into the hot water and saw again the woman in the Chekhov story, and the delight the male character had felt when he saw the water running into the bedroom sink. She took up her book and found the page she had last read and lay in the bath until she had closely read every last sentence. As it turned out, the woman did not marry her fiancé. She went instead to St. Petersburg and study at the university. When she returned to her hometown, the local boys cried out, "Betrothed! Betrothed!" in mockery over the fence, but it was little attention she paid to them, and in the end she once again said goodbye to her family and went back in high spirits to the city. Now she lay back in the bath with the water growing cold and looked through the open window. Beyond the window was a blue sky and a bare hill. I am 39 years old, she said. Her voice sounded foolish and loud in the tiled bathroom. At 7 o'clock, she felt a strong urge to write, but told herself it was not something she could do because of the German. She'd just be starting and getting warmed up when he would come, and then her work would be disrupted and she would have to stop. She did not like stopping once she'd started. Instead, she looked at herself in the mirror and pinned her hair up loosely and dressed. In the open room, she banked the fire with turf and whipped the cream. Then she went out with a bowl and walked around the house and picked blackberries off the briars. When the bowl was full, she looked out over the hills. The whitest clouds she had ever seen hugged tightly the brow of each, as though the hills had been on fire and the fires were now doused and smoking. She washed the berries, mashed them with sugar, and filled the cake. It looked to her a fine cake, laid there on the kitchen table. She put out white cups and saucers, small plates and spoons and 2 forks. When the knock came on the door, She stood in a part of the house where she could not be seen and listened as he knocked again. She let this happen once more, and then she went to the door and opened it. Outside was standing a short, middle-aged man dressed in a striped shirt and loose khaki trousers. His hair was thick and white, and from his neck on a long cord was hanging a large decorative cross. "Hello," she said, giving him a hand. "This is good of you," he said. "I am the intrusion." "Not at all," she said. "It's no trouble at all." "You are sure?" he said. "Of course," she said. "It's no trouble." She began quickly telling him the little she knew about the room they stood in, but he wasn't ready. He held up a hand and took from his satchel a half-litre bottle of Cointreau, wrapped in the white protective mesh one finds in duty-free shops. "It is for the house," he said. "This is very good of you." She took the bottle and looked at it and placed it on the table beside the cake. "What trouble you have made," the man said, looking at the cake. "It's nothing," she said, and wondered at that moment how he would respond if she gave him none. "This is the old part of the house," she began. "The other section was built later." He looked briefly at the room, at the walls, the turf, the pictures on the mantel, the fuchsia. He had not seemed the slightest bit interested in the room. She wondered if he had seen it all before. When she showed him Ball's study, he looked through the window at the falling darkness. "So this is the famous window?" "Yes, the sea is down there," she pointed through the glass. He glanced at the picture of Ball, at the framed letters on the wall. He glanced at her notebooks, the scraps of paper on the desk, and followed her along the corridor through other rooms, looking into them the way people look into rooms which are completely empty. In the last room, a long wooden bench stood under a window. She liked it here, liked the bare working feel of it. It was a room painters sometimes used. A few glass jars stood on the bench. A folding chair was splattered with red. Standing against the far wall was a mountain bike whose back tire was flat. "You ride this bike?" His tone was almost accusing. "I didn't even know it was here," she said. "It belongs to the house." At this, he leaned against the door frame and sighed. His hair, she realized, was damp, and she wondered if he hadn't been swimming. She wondered if it wasn't he who had been standing on the cliff while she was down at the cove. "So you're a professor of literature," she said quickly. "I was a professor," he said. "I'm retired now." "Do you miss teaching?" "It was long ago," he said, feeling his leather satchel. "You're writing here? You're working?" "Yes," she said. "And you, do you write?" "There is not much left in me to write," he said. "Time is running on." The way he said this made her wonder if he was not terminally ill. She searched his face for some sign of illness but found none. He had a healthy face and angry blue eyes. "What do you write?" she said. "Oh, small things, short things," he said. "Short stories?" No, he said dismissively. "Longer than that, but I do not have time. Everything takes too much time." "I see," she said. "Many people want to come here," he said. "I have seen these applications." He stretched out his arms and looked from one hand to the other at all the empty space in between. Many applications. "I'm lucky, I know," she said, and moved back into the direction of the open room, with him following close behind. The fire was now bright, and the open room was warmer than the rest of the house. There, without invitation, the professor sat down in what she thought would be her place and turned the cup upright on its saucer. As she put more turf on the fire, she felt a strong desire to lie down and sleep. "You'll have something to drink?" she said. No, he said. "I must drive." He was looking at the wildflowers. "Tea, then?" "You are making a lot of trouble." "It is no trouble at all." She felt tired of the word, of saying it, of having him say it. She made tea, put out milk, sugar, and cut a large piece of cake out of the cake. He smiled when she placed it before him. "You have made this?" "Yes," she said. "I have made it." He frowned and took a bite, and then another, so by the time she sat down, the piece of cake was gone. She cut another piece for him, and he ate that too, and drank the tea with a great deal of milk and sugar. "Ireland is not the same," he said. "People here were poor, but they were content. Do you think it's possible for poor people to be content?" He lifted his shoulders and let them fall, a child's response. He could neither create conversation nor be content to have one. She thought the least he could do was chat, which, in her opinion, was where all fine conversations began. She wondered if he really was ill and if he would soon die. She thought of him lying on his deathbed and felt no sympathy. "We were poor for long enough," she said then. "You're a Catholic?" he said. "I was reared Catholic. But now, do you believe?" "Now I don't know what I believe in," she said simply. "I used to be like you," he said. "I had no faith, but then I found my faith." She looked at him when he said this. She looked at the cross around his neck. She looked at the cake that was left and thought about how much time she had spent making it. "Many people want to work here," he said. People can work here now, she said. Not long ago we couldn't find work. No, he said, tapping the kitchen table with his finger. Work here, he said, in this house. Oh, she said, yes. Many people, he said. A long silence grew and hardened. She wondered what exactly he wanted. He was staring at her, waiting for a response. They must give it to the good-looking applicants, so, she laughed. Do you think so? He frowned and looked at her face. He examined her face closely and then shook his head. No, he said. You should have seen my wife. My wife was beautiful. He would have gone on, then, about his wife, would have told the entire story, had she not slowly reached for his cup and plate and put them in the sink and let the water run over them. She rinsed the plates and cups, stacked them in the dishwasher, closed the door and turned it on, even though it was not half full. She then wiped the counter with a damp cloth and stood at the sink, saying no more. She seemed reluctant to leave. He seemed reluctant to leave, and yet he must have surely realized that she no longer wanted him there. She leaned against the counter and folded her arms and made no further attempts at conversation. She stood like this until it was almost painful to do so, and then he rose. Slowly they walked to the door. While she was opening the latch, she had a strange notion that he might like to lock her out, so she let him out first and followed him. Outside, the night was quickly falling, and the hedge of fuchsia was again trembling brilliantly in the night wind. There was something he wanted to say, she felt, as she walked him past the gate. She stood close to the gate and he stood on the road beside her. She watched him take the keys out of his satchel and waited for him to speak. They could hear the waves thumping the strand below. 3 times a wave thumped and the strand before he spoke. These people, even German people at these conference meetings, he said, we do not understand each other. No? It is all jargon. We do not care. We do this because we cannot write, and yet here you are, a writer in this house of Henry Boll, making cakes. She took a breath. What? You come to this house of Henry Boll and make cakes and go swimming with no clothes on. What are you saying? Every year I come, and always it's the same people. People going around in their nightclothes in the middle of the day, riding this bicycle to public houses. At this point she heard herself and she began to laugh. You know nothing about Henry Boll, he cried. Don't you know that Henry Boll won the Nobel Prize for Literature? I think it is time you were gone, she said, going back through the gate and firmly sliding the bolt across. She was standing in the yard now watching him. He was younger than she had thought, she realised, as she saw him hopping in tempo on the road, and she could no longer understand a word, for his speech was now in German. For a time she stood watching the professor hopping on the public road, and then she walked as lightly as she could down the concrete path and went inside. What an awful man! What an awful, unhappy man, she thought as she locked the door. Had he no sense? And to think of all the trouble she'd gone to. She looked at the cake and felt like throwing it out the window after him. Instead, she put it in the back of the fridge and poured herself a glass of wine. She did not really feel like drinking wine, neither did she feel like sitting there in the house, but what else was there to do? In the end, she drank the wine quickly and threw more turf on the fire. She calmed down a little and opened the newspaper so as to think of something else, other things. Our system breeds fear and loathing in separated couples, writes Jean Sheridan. Just this week, 80% of Irish farmers said that they would be in favour of legal prenuptial agreements which would prevent their wives having any rights to their land. She looked at the date on the paper, turned out the lights and lay back in the light of the fire. There she took deep breaths and slowly let many things pass through her mind. She thought of the men she had known and how they had proposed marriage and how she had said yes to all of them but hadn't married one. She felt great fortune now in not having married any of these men, and a little wonder for ever having said she would. She turned over and heard the wind stirring the hedge all around the house. What had she expected or needed of tonight? All she had needed tonight was what every woman sometimes needs, a compliment. A barefaced lie would have sufficed. And she had made the stupid mistake of asking for the compliment. A woman of her age. Had she learned nothing? She pondered over this for a long time and did her best to sleep, but in the end she got up and boiled the kettle for coffee. It was late when she went into Boll's study. Another day was almost gone, but there she found herself at the desk, looking out through the famous window. There was an ocean out there, a high mountain and bare hills. She looked at the scraps of paper and read over them and put them to one side. The lid of her fountain pen was stiff, but she pulled it off and opened her notebook. It was a brand new notebook with stitched cream pages. Not until she was steadying the nib over the page did she realize her hand was shaking. Actual Island, she wrote, and the date. She stopped then and thought of what she had done with her birthday, how she had crossed the bridge at 3 a.m, and of the rhododendron hedges gone wild out of bloom. She thought of the plump hen flinging herself over the side of the cliff, and for good reason laughed and tried to describe the hen crossing the road. She began to describe the white stones too, and the warm water. As she wrote, she realised the hot stones must have heated the tide as it came in. She wrote of how it felt to lie there on the stones and the sounds they made under her feet when she walked over them. She thought of the German on the cliff and how it must have looked. Several times during that night as it passed, she wrote of how it felt to lie there on the stones and the sounds they made under her feet when she walked over them. She thought of the German on the cliff and how it must have looked. Several times during that night as it passed, she thought of Chekhov's light-hearted, complex heroine who never married, of the German professor saying how many people wanted to come here and how greedily he ate her cake. She thought of his temper and began to imagine the life his wife must have had with him. At one point she looked up and saw light spilling across the land. For a moment, seeing daylight, she felt a deep longing for sleep, but she couldn't stop. She had just given him a name and cancer and was working through his illness. As she worked, the sun rose. It's a fine thing to sit there describing a sick man and to feel the sun rising. If it again, at some point later, filled her with a new longing for sleep, she fought against it and kept on, working with her head down, concentrating on the pages. Already she had made the incision in place and time, and infused it with a climate and longing. There was earth and fire and water on these pages. There was a man and a woman and a human loneliness. Something about the work was elemental and plain. By this time, her central character had lost his appetite, and she was introducing his relatives and drafting his will. She went over the passages where his beautiful wife was offering him broth, and in doing so realised she was hungry. When she got up, she felt stiff and pleased. She looked out at the morning striking the road beyond the trembling hedge and knew the time for sleep had come and gone. As she put the kettle on to boil and reached for the cake at the back of the fridge, she stretched herself, and she knew she was preparing for his long and painful death.